Did you ever wonder what life was really like under the thumb of a medieval queen? From the grand castles to the dusty villages, their word was law. But sometimes those laws were undeniably strange. We are talking about the medieval era, a time stretching roughly from the 5th to the 15th centuries, when power was absolute and royal whims could reshape daily life in the most unexpected ways. What bizarre rules might a queen conjure up when she held all the cards prepared to dive into some truly unbelievable decrees? Number 1. Isabella of Castile and the regulation of religious tassels. The late 15th century in Spain was a cauldron of grand ambition, religious fervor, and the forging of a new national identity. At the heart of it all stood Queen Isabella, the first of Castile, a monarch whose will was as unyielding as the mountains separating her kingdoms. With her husband Ferdinand II of Aragon, she had united much of Spain, expelled the last Moorish rulers from Granada, and embarked on an era of unprecedented exploration. She was also deeply, profoundly religious, a devotion that shaped not just her personal life, but the very laws of her burgeoning empire. As the fires of the Reconquista cooled, and the intricate tapestry of Spain was rewoven with Christian threads, Isabella's focus shifted to establishing order, uniformity, and piety throughout her realm. She believed that external expressions of faith were crucial for internal devotion, a visible testament to the Catholic conversion of a land that had for centuries housed diverse religious practices. It was in this atmosphere of intense spiritual zeal and a desire for meticulous control that one of her most peculiar decrees took root. The decree issued from the royal court in Toledo in the year 1493 was not about grand crusades or the financing of New World expeditions. Instead, it delved into the minutiae of religious expression, focusing on something seemingly insignificant: the number and color of tassels permitted on prayer garments worn by commoners. The specific wording, later recorded in the Royal Ordinances 1490 Thestor, save for those explicitly granted dispensation by royal decree for meritorious service to the crown, shall possess or wear any prayer shawl, rosary, or devotional belt adorned with more than 3 tassels, nor shall any such tassel be dyed in a hue resembling royal purple. It was a precise, almost unbelievably specific regulation for the everyday spiritual life of her subjects. The reasoning, as articulated by the Queen's advisors in court records, was ostensibly to prevent ostentatious displays of false piety and to ensure humility and reverence appropriate to one's station. However, it was also subtly understood to be a method of social control, a way to distinguish between the truly devoted and those merely performative, and to reinforce the hierarchy, even in matters of faith. The forbidden colors, royal purple, imperial gold, and crimson red, were reserved for the clergy and high nobility, symbols of their elevated status and closeness to divine authority. To see such colors or an excessive number of tassels on a commoner's prayer garment was in the Queen's eyes an affront to the established order, a blurring of lines that Isabella was determined to keep sharp. Enforcement of this decree fell to local alcaldes and, more importantly, to the newly empowered brotherhoods and religious fraternities that patrolled the streets and markets, often with a zealous eye for any deviation from the Queen's dictates. Imagine a bustling market square in Seville, the air thick with the scent of spices and the chatter of merchants. A man, perhaps a weaver from the Triana district, walks by his simple woolen prayer shawl draped over his shoulders. An alcalde, accompanied by 2 stern-faced members of the Santa Hermandad, stops him. Their eyes immediately fix on the shawl. "Sir, your prayer garment," one of them might say, his voice flat. "Count your tassels." The weaver, a man of humble means, might fumble, his heart pounding. Perhaps he had inherited the shawl from his grandfather, a relic of a time when such specific rules were unheard of. He counts. 4 tassels, and one of them a faded thread of crimson, perhaps from a long-forgotten festival. 4 tassels, the alcalde would declare, his voice rising, and a forbidden color. Do you defy the Queen's sacred ordinance? The penalties for transgressing this seemingly minor rule were not inconsequential. For a first offense, the offending tassels would be publicly cut off and the garment confiscated. A second offense could lead to a fine or even a short period in the stocks, a humiliating public spectacle designed to deter others. Chroniclers like Juan de Mariana, though more focused on grander political events, occasionally recorded instances of such minor infractions being punished, noting the Queen's uncompromising stance on even the smallest details of public order and morality. He wrote in his Historia General de España of the Queen's fervent desire for a realm purged of all that was not pure, even to the very threads of a common man's devotion. The decree, of course, caused considerable grumbling among the common folk. Many felt it was an intrusion into their private spiritual lives, a royal overreach into the very connection between a person and God. Old women who had spun and dyed their own threads for generations found themselves having to adjust their cherished garments. Market stalls that once sold brightly colored threads in every conceivable shade suddenly found their inventories limited, favoring muted tones and simple designs. Tailors and weavers, previously accustomed to creating diverse spiritual garments, had to adapt their craft to the Queen's precise specifications. Some attempted to skirt the rules. There were tales whispered in taverns and hushed in marketplaces of clever seamstresses who would weave in hidden tassels, barely visible or disguised as part of the garment's main pattern, only to be unfurled in the privacy of one's home. Others would use naturally occurring dyes that almost resembled the forbidden colors, but were technically different, leading to endless arguments with overzealous enforcers. These small acts of defiance, though minor in the grand scheme of royal power, highlighted the friction between a queen's desire for total control and the innate human need for personal expression, even in matters of faith. While Isabella's reign is rightly remembered for its momentous achievements, the unification of Spain, the voyages of Columbus, this decree stands as a testament to the extent to which a powerful medieval monarch could exert her will over the daily existence of her subjects. It was a bizarre, almost pedantic law, yet it reflected a deep-seated belief in the power of visual conformity and the meticulous crafting of a pious, ordered society. Even if it meant inspecting the tassels on the farmer's prayer shawl. The echoes of this rule, though eventually fading with time, certainly left their mark on the cultural fabric of a newly unified Spain. Number 2. Urraca of León and Castile, and the annual cricket, chorus levy. In the early 12th century, the Iberian Peninsula was a patchwork of warring kingdoms constantly vying for supremacy. Standing at the heart of this tumultuous landscape was Urraca of León and Castile, a woman who broke every mold. She was not just a queen, but a reigning monarch in her own right, inheriting her father's vast domains. Her reign from 1109 to 1126 was characterized by political intrigue, personal scandals, and relentless military campaigns to secure her contested throne from ambitious nobles. A resentful former husband and her own illegitimate half-brother, Urraca was known for her fierce independence, her quick temper, and an unconventional approach to governance. She distrusted many of her male advisors and often relied on her own shrewd instincts, which sometimes led to utterly perplexing decisions. It was in the midst of one of her many campaigns to assert authority over rebellious regional lords that she issued a decree that bewildered her court and became a source of much whispered amusement, yet it underscored her peculiar methods of enforcing submission. The decree, formalized in a royal writ, dispatched from the besieged castle of Castile in 1118, was not about taxes or military conscription, though those were constant concerns. Instead, it demanded a yearly tribute that was as impractical as it was unexpected. The writ stated with formal elegance that every lord, count, and baron holding as a sign of their continued loyalty and devotion. Diviver a sacrament of royal court no later than the feast of St. John the Baptist, each to be proven capable of sustained chirping, each capable of mimicking at least 3 distinct human words or phrases. Failure to comply, the decree warned, would result in the confiscation of a significant portion of the defaulting lord's grain harvest, a punishment that struck at the very sustenance of their lands. The stated reason for this bizarre levy, as conveyed through Urraca's heralds, was the queen's desire to cultivate a royal menagerie of wondrous creatures, whose melodious chirps and clever imitations would soothe our royal spirit and serve as a testament to the diverse and vibrant bounty of our lands. However, beneath this ostensibly aesthetic motive lay a deeper, more manipulative purpose. It was not easy to capture 100 healthy chirping crickets, let alone keep them alive and chirping for a long journey to the royal court. And training ravens to speak distinct words was an art form, not a common skill among medieval Castellans. The difficulty of the demand was precisely the point. This decree was a test of obedience, a way for Urraca to gauge the true extent of her lord's submission. If a lord could fulfill such an absurd, logistically challenging request, it demonstrated a willingness to bend to her will, even when that will was capricious. It also served as a subtle humiliation. Imagine a proud, battle-hardened count, renowned for his military prowess, now tasked with overseeing the capture of insects or the linguistic tutelage of corvids. The decree forced them to divert resources and attention to a task entirely unrelated to defense or administration, reinforcing Urraca's absolute, even whimsical, power. Enforcement, while challenging, was taken seriously by the Queen's appointed royal inspectors. Chroniclers like Pelayo of Oviedo, though often critical of Urraca's unconventional reign, noted this specific edict. He observed in his Chronicon Regum Legionensium that the Queen, in her peculiar wisdom, sought fealty not through force alone, but through the imposition of tasks both grand and ludicrous, a method which confounded many a hardened lord. Consider the scene at a local lord's keep in the dusty plains of Castile. Baron Rodrigo, a grizzled veteran of countless border skirmishes, stares in disbelief at the royal writ. "Crickets," he bellows, slamming his fist on the oak table. 100 chirping crickets or talking ravens? Are we farmers of song or warriors? Yet the penalty for non-compliance was severe. Losing a significant portion of his grain harvest meant starving his people, weakening his castle, and risking the Queen's wrath. So, Rodrigo's men, often seasoned knights who had faced down Moorish cavalry, found themselves creeping through fields at night, nets in hand, chasing elusive insects. Others attempted to lure ravens, then spent weeks, even months, repeating phrases like "Long live Urraca" or "Castile's might." To confused birds, the absurdity of it all was almost unbearable. Letters from various regional lords to each other, now preserved in archival fragments, often contained exasperated complaints about the Queen's chirping madness or the avian tax. One such letter from Count Fernando of Lara bemoaned the fact that his finest falconer, a man whose skills with birds of prey were legendary, was now tasked with teaching a common raven to say, "Your Majesty," without squawking like a common pigeon. The annual delivery of these bizarre tributes became a spectacle at the royal court. Lords, often red-faced, with a mixture of embarrassment, would arrive with cages of chirping crickets, their cacophony echoing through the grand halls, or with ravens perched on their shoulders of human speech. To the amusement of the Queen and her ladies in waiting, some attempts were spectacular failures. Count from Galicia arrived with a crate of crickets only to find them mostly silent, having expired from the long journey. His grain harvest was seized, and the Count returned home humiliated. Another lord, desperate to avoid the fine, presented a single raven that could only caw its own name, Corvus Corvus. While the decree likely did little to enhance the true stability of Urraca's realm, which remained turbulent throughout her reign, it certainly cemented her reputation as a monarch who defied convention. It demonstrated her absolute power in the most unconventional way possible, forcing powerful men to engage in tasks that were beneath their dignity, serving as a constant chirping or squawking reminder of who truly held the reins of power in León and Castile. The annual cricket chorus levy stands as a peculiar footnote in the history of medieval governance, a testament to a queen whose methods were as unpredictable as the political landscape she navigated. Number 3. Margaret of Anjou and the prohibition of red-plumed birds. The mid-15th century in England was a period of brutal civil strife, known as the Wars of the Roses. At the heart of the Lancastrian cause, fiercely defending the throne for her young son Henry VI, stood Queen Margaret of Anjou. She was no shrinking violet. Intelligent, ambitious, and utterly unyielding, Margaret was a formidable political and military leader who rode into battle, rallied armies, and faced down her Yorkist enemies with a ferocity that earned her the moniker She-Wolf of France. Her life was a constant struggle to secure her son's precarious crown against the White Rose of the House of York. Every action she took, every decree she issued, was steeped in the urgency of war and the need to bolster the Lancastrian cause. It was in this climate of paranoia, superstition, and an unrelenting fight for loyalty that Margaret issued a decree that, while seemingly petty, revealed the depth of her strategic thinking, or perhaps her descent into desperation. The decree, promulgated from her wartime court in Coventry in the year 1460, was simple, yet baffling in its specificity. It declared that no loyal subject of the crown, nor any dwelling within lands held by fealty to His Majesty King Henry VI, shall consume the flesh of any bird possessing plumage of a distinct crimson, scarlet, or ruby red hue. The decree went on to state that the consumption of such birds was to be deemed an act of ill omen, a weakening of the true Lancastrian spirit, and an unwitting endorsement of the Yorkist opposition. Furthermore, it explicitly encouraged the consumption of birds with blue or white feathers, promoting them as bearers of good fortune and strengthening of heart. The obvious reason for this bizarre culinary dictate was the symbolic color of the Yorkist faction, the white rose. However, Margaret's decree twisted this symbolism into something more sinister. The Yorkists' colors were white, and sometimes blue. Red, on the other hand, was not explicitly a Yorkist color, but the decree linked it to ill omen and weakening of spirit. Perhaps it was a preemptive strike, suggesting that anything visually vibrant and striking like the bold red of some birds might too easily evoke the passionate rivalries and bloodshed of the war itself. Or perhaps it was a deeper, more arcane superstition on Margaret's part. It aimed to subtly instill a psychological aversion to a color, tying it to disloyalty and misfortune, while subtly promoting the good colors of blue, associated with nobility and loyalty, and white, associated with purity, though perhaps not the Yorkist white. The enforcement was left to local magistrates and even tavern keepers, who were encouraged to report any breaches. Imagine a busy market day in a Lancastrian town. A farmer, proud of his plump roasted pheasant, its iridescent feathers a beautiful crimson, tries to sell it. Keen-eyed market official, perhaps a veteran of a recent skirmish, might approach. "Good sir, whence came this bird?" he would ask, eyeing the rich red plumage. "Are you not aware of the Queen's sacred edict?" Penalties, while not as severe as outright treason, could still be harsh. Confiscation of the meat, public shaming, or even a small fine were common. More zealous enforcers might even extend the prohibition to garments or banners, though the decree specifically mentioned consumption. Common folk, already weary from constant war and unpredictable levies, found themselves navigating another strange rule. What difference did the color of a bird's feathers make to the outcome of a battle? Yet the Queen's command was absolute. Chroniclers of the time, such as John Warkworth, whose chronicle covers the Wars of the Roses, occasionally noted the peculiar edicts emanating from the Lancastrian court. While not dedicating extensive passages to this particular decree, Warkworth did comment on the Queen's curious and sometimes inexplicable demands upon the loyalty of her subjects, often extending to matters of daily sustenance and trivial habit, yet all designed to solidify her cause. Letters between Lancastrian nobles, preserved in fragmented family archives, sometimes contained wry remarks about the difficulty of finding untainted fowl for their dinners, or the tree caused minor disruption in daily life. Hunters, already struggling with the demands of providing for war, now had to be discerning not just about the size and health of their prey, but its plumage. Cooks in noble households had to revise their menus, favoring pale poultry and game birds of more muted colors. The market for certain types of birds, like the vibrant bullfinch, or certain species of thrush, if consumed, dwindled in Lancastrian-controlled territories. Meanwhile, birds with naturally blue or white feathers, such as swans, though typically reserved for nobility, pigeons, or certain types of geese, saw a subtle rise in popularity and demand. The decree was not simply about preventing the consumption of red bird. It was a constant, subtle reminder of the war, a daily psychological nudge. Every meal, every bird caught or purchased became a small test of loyalty. By associating the forbidden color with ill omen, Margaret sought to instill a deep-seated, almost superstitious aversion to anything that might remotely symbolize the enemy. Even in the abstract, it was a bizarre blend of superstition, propaganda, and a queen's desperate attempt to control every aspect of her subjects' lives, even their diets, in the relentless pursuit of victory. While the Wars of the Roses ultimately ended with the defeat of the Lancastrians, Margaret's red-plumed bird decree of how medieval monarchs could weave their political and personal anxieties into the very fabric of daily life, using every tool at their disposal, even the color of a bird's feathers, to fight for their crown, certainly stands out as one of the more unusual attempts to rally a kingdom by regulating its dinner plates. Number 4. Joan I of Naples and the courtier's daily poem of praise. The mid-14th century saw the Kingdom of Naples as a significant power in southern Italy, a vibrant crossroads of cultures and political ambition. At its helm was Joan I, a queen whose long reign from 1343 to 1382 was a whirlwind of dramatic events, assassinations, papal interventions, multiple marriages, and constant challenges to her authority. Joan was a woman of immense intelligence, charm, and a sharp wit, but she also possessed a deep-seated need for affirmation and a formidable ego. Surrounded by shifting alliances and treacherous courtiers, she sought to maintain control, not just through political maneuvering and military might, but through the cultivation of absolute loyalty and a highly ritualized courtly life. It was in this environment, amidst concerns about whispers and conspiracies within her own palace walls, that Joan issued a decree that cemented her image as a monarch deeply preoccupied with her own image. It was a decree that turned her court into a stage for daily compulsory acts of flattery, revealing her desire for constant, tangible proof of her courtiers' devotion. The decree issued from her royal palace in Naples in 1358 was formally known as the Ordinance of the Daily Tribute of Verse. It stipulated, with no room for ambiguity, that every nobleman, lady-in-waiting, and official of the royal court, from the highest-ranking chamberlain, shall, before the evening repast, present a freshly composed poem, no less than 8 lines, beauty, wisdom, or beneficence. Beauty, wisdom, or beneficence for Majesty the Queen. The decree went on to state that these poems were to be recited aloud before the assembled court during dinner, and shall be subject to critical assessment by a panel of our most esteemed ladies for sincerity, poetic merit, and genuine admiration. Failure to present a poem, or a poem deemed insincere, uninspired, or lacking in appropriate reverence, could result in a range of penalties from public censure and a temporary banishment from courtly gatherings to, for repeated offenders, dismissal from court and forfeiture of royal favor. The stated reason for this bizarre demand, as articulated by Joan herself to her closest confidants, and later recorded by a chronicler, Giovanni Viani, in his Nuova Cronica, who mentioned her peculiar appetite, Gioli adulation, was to foster a spirit of intellectual cultivation and was to foster within our court, ensuring that minds are sharpened and spirits lifted by the pursuit of noble verse. However, the true purpose was far more practical and self-serving. It was a loyalty test, a way to ferret out disaffection. A person who struggled to praise the Queen daily, or whose verse felt forced, was clearly not genuinely devoted. It also served as a constant public demonstration of her power and the total submission of her court. Enforcement was rigorous, led by a rotating panel of Joan's most trusted and often most sycophantic ladies. Imagine the grand dining hall of the Castel Nuovo in Naples, the air heavy with the scent of roasted meats and fine wines. As dinner approached, a hush would fall. Then, one by one, the courtiers, from grizzled generals to elegant ladies, would step forward. They would clear their throats, perhaps nervously adjust their silks, and begin their recitations. One young knight, famed for his prowess with a sword but not a quill, might stammer through a hastily scrawled sonnet, praising the Queen's eyes like the deep azure of the Tyrrhenian Sea. An older, more jaded diplomat might offer a technically perfect, but utterly soulless, ode to her wisdom in governance. Queen, often seated at the head of the table, would listen intently, a slight, knowing smile playing on her lips, while her ladies-in-waiting would jot down notes, their expressions ranging from rapt attention to barely concealed amusement. Poem deemed too short, too trite, or too obviously plagiarized, a common occurrence leading to a sub-industry of court poets secretly selling verses, would be met with a cold stare from the Queen and a withering critique from her panel. Sir Reginald, a lady might declare, "Your verse comparing Her Majesty's beauty to the blooming rose lacks the originality of true adoration. We have heard such comparisons 1,000 times." The accused courtier would bow, flushed with embarrassment, and perhaps face a week of being excluded from the Queen's private audiences. For repeated offenders, the consequences could be dire: loss of patronage, banishment to a provincial estate, or even in extreme cases a period of imprisonment. Contemporary accounts, including letters from various ambassadors to the Neapolitan court, often expressed a mixture of bewilderment and amusement at this daily ritual. One ambassador from Florence, writing to his duke, described the scene as a theater of forced adoration, where the most eloquent words often concealed the most resentful hearts. Yet he also acknowledged the effectiveness of the decree in maintaining a public facade of unwavering loyalty. The decree undoubtedly fostered a strange kind of literary competition within the court. Courtiers who had never written a verse in their lives suddenly found themselves poring over rhyming dictionaries and pleading with scholarly monks for lessons in poetic meter. A new market emerged for professional poets who could supply verses for the less creatively inclined, often at exorbitant prices. Some courtiers tried to inject genuine humor or wit into their poems, only to be met with severe disapproval if the Queen felt they were not sufficiently serious in their praise. The daily poem of praise stands as a vivid example of Joan's mercurial nature and her relentless pursuit of control, even over the artistic expressions of her courtiers. It was a daily public affirmation of her absolute power, forcing her subjects to not only obey her laws, but to actively profess their devotion in the most personal and creative way possible. While it may have created an environment of performative loyalty, it certainly ensured that Joan I of Naples was never wanting for praise. It was a bizarre, yet undeniably effective way for a powerful queen to maintain her grip on a notoriously turbulent court. Number 5. Philippa of Hainaut and the Minot Laughter Hour. The England of the mid-14th century, under King Edward III, was a nation defined by its growing prowess in the 100 Years' War and the unfolding grandeur of its chivalric court. Beside Edward stood Queen Philippa of Hainaut, a figure renowned for her compassion, wisdom, and diplomatic skill. She was often credited with tempering her husband's fiery temper and was beloved by the English people for her gentle nature and acts of kindness, famously interceding with the king on behalf of the burghers of Calais. Yet even a queen celebrated for her benevolence could issue decrees that, from a modern perspective, appear utterly bewildering. Philippa, concerned with the morale of her subjects, particularly as the ongoing wars took their toll and the shadow of the Black Death loomed large, envisioned a realm not just orderly and prosperous, but genuinely joyous. She believed that public happiness was a vital component of a stable kingdom, and she was determined to legislate. It was in this spirit of well-intentioned yet deeply strange social engineering that Philippa issued her most peculiar ordinance from Westminster in the year 1348. The decree, formally titled the Ordinance for the Cultivation of Public Merriment, mandated a daily laughter hour throughout all royal boroughs and market towns. Proxime stated that every citizen, from the humble artisan to the prosperous merchant, shall between the hours of 2 and 3 of the afternoon engage in accidive. During this hour, all work not essential for the immediate sustenance of life shall cease, and all citizens shall endeavor to make merry, tell humorous tales, sing uplifting songs, as shall fill the air with joyous sound. Furthermore, the decree sternly warned against visible melancholy, undue somberness, or failure to participate in the general spirit of uplift unless afflicted by genuine illness or recent bereavement, to be confirmed by local clergy. Penalties for non-compliance included public censure, forced attendance at a jester's performance, or, for repeated and egregious violations, a fine to be paid in ale or bread, distributed to the poor. Philippa's stated reason for the decree, as recorded in the court records and letters of the time, was her profound desire to banish the shadows of sorrow and anxiety from our beloved people, and to ensure that the spirits of all subjects remain buoyant and robust, for a joyful people are a healthy people. She genuinely believed that enforcing happiness could improve public health and resilience during a period of considerable national stress. It was a benevolent intention, but implemented with a remarkable lack of understanding about human emotion. Enforcement was delegated to local constables and guilds who were tasked with patrolling their areas during the designated laughter hour. Imagine a quiet English village street. The stroke of 2, a bell might toll, signaling the beginning of the mandatory merriment. A group of weavers moments ago bent over their looms would suddenly be obligated to put down their tools. Perhaps one would attempt a clumsy jig, another a forced chuckle. A baker, who had just burnt a batch of loaves, would find himself forced to grin while his neighbors tried to tell a bad joke. The decree caused widespread bewilderment and a considerable amount of forced awkward laughter. Chroniclers like Jean Froissart, though more focused on the grand narratives of war and chivalry, did occasionally touch upon the more unusual aspects of court life. While he did not dedicate a full passage to this specific decree, his general observations on Philippa's gentle but firm hand in matters of domestic order hint at her willingness to impose her vision of a harmonious society. Letters between merchants and landowners, now preserved in archival collections, sometimes contained exasperated remarks about the Queen's hour of forced jollity, or the difficulty of conducting business when everyone was obligate. The decree certainly led to some absurd situations. Public squares, usually filled with trade and gossip, would transform into scenes of strained mirth. Groups of villagers might gather awkwardly, attempting to force laughter or tell stale jokes. Jesters, often employed by local lords, suddenly found themselves in high demand, traveling from village to provide entertainment. During the laughter hour, though their performances often failed to elicit genuine mirth from their unwilling audience, farmers, pausing from their fieldwork, would sometimes simply stand in their fields, staring blankly, trying to recall a funny anecdote, while their children, less burdened by the absurdity, might genuinely find amusement in the strange sight. Penalties, while not overtly cruel, were effective in their own way. Being publicly identified as a melancholic or somber person was a mark of shame in a society that valued conformity and community spirit. A fine in ale or bread meant a tangible loss, however small, for the sake of failing to perform happiness. True grief or illness was usually excused, but the burden of proof lay with the individual, often requiring a visit from the parish priest to confirm their legitimate sorrow. While the laughter hour decree eventually faded, perhaps due to the sheer impracticality of legislating human emotion, it stands as a testament to Queen Philippa's unique approach to governance. It revealed a monarch who, despite her genuine benevolence, believed that public happiness could be commanded, and that a cheerful populace was not just a desirable outcome but a duty. It remains one of the most bizarre and well-intentioned, yet ultimately futile attempts by a medieval queen to control the very spirits of her people. Number 6. Blanche of Castile and the Royal Orphan's annual recitation. In the early 13th century, France was navigating the complexities of a young king's minority and the lingering tensions of crusades. At the heart of this intricate political landscape was Blanche of Castile, mother of Louis IX. St. Louis. As queen regent for much of her son's early reign, Blanche wielded immense power and did so with an iron will, remarkable intelligence, and a deep, almost zealous, devotion to God and the French monarchy. She faced down rebellious barons, handled papal disputes, and shaped her son into one of France's most revered kings. Blanche was a stern and meticulous ruler, obsessed with order, education, and the moral upbringing of the youth. She believed that a well-ordered society began with a well-educated populace, particularly those under royal protection. It was this intense focus on cultivation, combined with a rather grand vision of intellectual virtue, that led her to issue a decree that, while seemingly benevolent, was utterly impractical. The decree, issued from the royal chancellery in Paris in the year 1230, was known as the Ordinance for the Cultivation of the Royal Orphan. It specifically targeted children who had lost their parents and were taken under the direct guardianship of the crown, housed in various monasteries, convents, and charitable institutions, supported by the royal purse. The decree stated that every orphan under the direct protection and sustenance of Her Majesty, upon reaching the age of 10 years, shall commence Samar at the feast of Saint Martin. Each year, every such orphan shall present themselves before a royal official, or if proximity pits, before our person, to recite memorized passage of no less than 50 words in the Aramaic tongue. The decree justified this by claiming it would foster intellectual discipline, imbue a reverence for sacred knowledge, and equip these unfortunate souls with a rare and noble skill, thereby proving their worthiness of royal patronage. Failure to pass the annual recitation would result in a reduction of their royal stipend or a less favorable placement within a monastic order. The stated reason, as conveyed through Blanche's various pronouncements, was her belief that such rigorous academic training would elevate the minds of these vulnerable children, transforming them from objects of charity into assets of the kingdom, Embodying a unique form of learned piety, she envisioned a core of highly educated, morally upright individuals, indebted to the crown for their esoteric knowledge. However, the sheer impracticality of teaching Aramaic, a Semitic language, with a complex script and grammar, to hundreds of mostly unlettered medieval orphans, many of whom barely understood Latin, was staggering. It was a grand vision disconnected from the reality of medieval education. Enforcement was the responsibility of the abbots and abbesses who housed the orphans, often with the assistance of learned monks or scholars employed by the queen. Imagine a bleak, echoing monastery scriptorium. Small, bewildered orphans, some as young as 10, huddle around a single flickering candle, trying to decipher strange characters and sounds under the watchful eye of a patient, but equally bewildered, monk. They were accustomed to basic literacy, maybe some Latin, but Aramaic was an entirely different beast. The decree caused considerable consternation among the monastic orders, tasked with its implementation. Records from various abbeys, now preserved in France's national archives, contain numerous petitions to the Queen, subtly hinting at the immense difficulty of finding qualified instructors, the resistance of the children themselves. One letter from the Abbot of Saint-Denis to the Royal Chancellery complained that the young charges, though willing in spirit, possess minds ill-suited to the subtleties of Eastern tongues, and our few scholars proficient in such languages are already burdened by the copying of Holy Scripture. The annual recitation day was a scene of nervous anticipation. Royal officials, often scholars themselves, would arrive at various institutions. Orphans, dressed in their simple monastic tunics, would stand before them, their small hands clutching scrolls of foreign script. Many would falter, forgetting lines or mispronouncing words. The pressure was immense. A failed recitation meant a reduced allowance, perhaps less food or a less desirable future within the church, forcing them into manual labor rather than scholarly pursuits. While the decree undoubtedly led to a handful of exceptional orphans who genuinely excelled in Aramaic, the vast majority struggled immensely. Created a strange subculture among these royal wards, a shared burden of obscure linguistic study. Tales whispered among the orphans themselves spoke of clever tricks to memorize phonetic sounds without truly understanding their meaning, or of sharing notes on the easiest passages to commit to memory. Some learned of a few stock phrases, just enough to pass the minimal requirement, then quickly forgot them the moment a royal official departed. Blanche's decree, despite its noble intentions to foster learning and piety, stands as a peculiar testament to her ambition and perhaps her occasional detachment from the practical realities of medieval life. It forced hundreds of vulnerable children into a demanding, largely irrelevant linguistic pursuit, demonstrating a royal belief that even the most obscure knowledge could be commanded into existence. It was a bizarre yet characteristic attempt by a powerful regent to mold her kingdom's future by shaping the minds of its most vulnerable citizens through the unlikely medium of an ancient, forgotten tongue. The annual Aramaic recitations, while fading into obscurity as Blanche's regency ended, certainly provided a unique, albeit strange, intellectual challenge for a generation of French orphans. Number 7. Eleanor of Aquitaine and the standardized green for courtly garments. The 12th century in France and England was a period of immense cultural flourishing, and at its heart was Eleanor of Aquitaine, Queen first of France, then of England. Eleanor was a woman of legendary beauty, sharp intellect, and independent spirit. She presided over some of the most vibrant and sophisticated courts in medieval Europe, particularly her court at Poitiers, which became a celebrated center for courtly love, poetry, and chivalry. Eleanor was not merely a political figure. She was a cultural arbiter, setting trends in fashion, literature, and social graces. Eleanor was deeply involved in the minutiae of court life, often dictating protocols and fostering an atmosphere of refined elegance. It was this meticulous attention to detail, combined with a desire to maintain a distinct and sophisticated aesthetic, within her inner circle that led to one of her most eccentric and famously rigid decrees concerning fashion. It was a decree that turned something as simple as a color into a strict matter of royal protocol, bordering on the absurd. The decree issued from her court in Poitiers around the year 1170 was not about grand political alliances or the funding of crusades, though Eleanor was involved in both. Instead, it was an incredibly specific ordinance regarding the shade of green allowed for certain courtly garments. The ordinance of the verdant hue, as it came to be known, stipulated that no lady or gentleman of our court, nor any attending upon our personages, shall wear any garment or accessory dyed in the color green, unless such green matches precisely the shade of Poitou spring green, as defined by the master dyers in our royal employ. The decree went on to state that this specific shade, a rich, vibrant hue reminiscent of the early growth of grass in her beloved Poitou, was to be the only acceptable green, would be deemed an unacceptable affront to courtly harmony. And a lack of true aesthetic discernment. Penalties for transgression included the confiscation of the offending garment, public admonishment by a lady-in-waiting, and a temporary ban from courtly entertainments. Eleanor's stated reason for this decree, as recorded by chroniclers like Roger of Howden, who often commented on her strict adherence to courtly decorum, was her desire to elevate the standards of fashion and ensure a harmonious visual spectacle within our court. She believed that even the slightest disharmony in color could disrupt the elegant atmosphere she sought to cultivate. It was also subtly a way to distinguish her inner circle, creating a unique visual identity for her court that set it apart from other, perhaps less discerning, royal households. Only the most skilled dyers, often those directly overseen by the Queen's household, could consistently produce this exact shade, making it a subtle mark of privilege. Enforcement of this decree fell to the Queen's chamberlains, and more keenly to her ladies-in-waiting, who became adept at spotting the slightest deviation in hue. Imagine a grand feast at a royal castle. Ladies and gentlemen in their finest silks and velvets mingle the air, filled with music and laughter. A young countess eager to make a good impression enters resplendent in a gown of what she believes to be a perfect green. But as she approaches the Queen's days, one of Eleanor's ladies, famed for her discerning eye, might lean forward. "My dear," she might say, her voice barely a whisper, "your gown? A lovely green, yes, but is it truly Poitou spring green? It seems a shade too yellow, perhaps, or too deep." The Countess would pale. A sample swatch of the precise Poitou spring green was often kept on hand by the ladies, used as a reference point for comparison. A subtle difference, undetectable to the common eye, could be a serious breach of etiquette. The master dyers were often called upon to certify the color, turning a simple matter of fashion into a rigorous, almost scientific inspection. The decree caused significant distress among the courtly elite. Dyers across England and France struggled to replicate the precise shade, as variations in natural dyes, water sources, and weaving processes made exact duplication increstate. Tailors suddenly found themselves tasked not just with cutting and stitching, but with obsessing over the precise hue of their green fabrics. Letters between noblewomen, now preserved in archival collections, often contained exasperated laments about the tyranny of the Poitou green, or frantic requests for scraps of fabric that truly matched the Queen's preferred shade. Penalties, while not physically painful, were deeply humiliating for those who prided themselves on their status and appearance. To have a beautiful gown confiscated in public, or to be publicly admonished for a fashion faux pas, was a blow to one's social standing. Being temporarily banned from courtly entertainments meant missing out on crucial networking, gossip, and opportunities for royal favor. This was a severe punishment in a society where access to the monarch was paramount. Eleanor's decree, while seemingly a trivial matter of fashion, stands as a powerful testament to her absolute authority and her singular vision for her court. It demonstrated her meticulous control over every aspect of her royal household, even down to the shades of color worn by her courtiers. It was a bizarre yet very Eleanor-esque attempt to craft an environment of unparalleled elegance and conformity, where even the most vibrant color was subject to a queen's exacting standard, defining a fashion standard that was as strict as any law of the land. Number 8. Matilda of England and the Royal Blue Door Ordinance. The 12th century in England was a period of tumultuous civil war, known as the Anarchy. Empress Matilda, daughter of King Henry I, fought relentlessly to claim her rightful throne from her cousin Stephen of Blois. Her reign, though brief and contested, was marked by fierce determination, military campaigns, and a constant struggle to assert her legitimacy against a kingdom torn by competing loyalties. Matilda was a formidable figure, often described as strong-willed and uncompromising traits necessary to survive and fight in such a brutal period. As she moved across the war-torn landscape, consolidating what little power she could, Matilda faced the constant challenge of distinguishing loyal territories from those sympathetic to Stephen. Trust was a rare commodity, and signs of allegiance were desperately needed. It was in this climate of suspicion and the urgent need for visible loyalty that Matilda issued one of her most visually striking, and from a modern perspective, peculiar decrees. The decree, issued from her temporary stronghold in Winchester in the year 1141, was known as the Ordinance of the Azure Portal. It declared that every household, manor, and dwelling within lands acknowledging the rightful claim of Her Majesty Empress Matilda shall, upon pain of immediate forfeiture of property, paint its primary entryway or front door with a coat of royal Matilda blue. The decree went on to state that this act was to be a visible and undeniable testament of true fealty to the legitimate crown, marking loyal subjects from those who harbor treasonous sympathies. Failure to comply by a specified date or the presence of any other color on one's main door was to be interpreted as an act of defiance and disloyalty, leading to the immediate confiscation of the property by royal agents and its redistribution to loyal supporters. Matilda's stated reason for this decree, as conveyed through her heralds and recorded in contemporary letters from her supporters, was her urgent need to discern the true hearts of our subjects from those who masquerade as loyal while secretly supporting our usurper. She believed that a universally visible sign of allegiance was necessary to quickly identify and reward her supporters, while equally swiftly punishing her enemies. It was a bizarre yet practical solution to a problem of visual identification in a chaotic time, forcing immediate and public declarations of loyalty in a way that left no room for ambiguity. The specific shade of blue was likely chosen not just for its royal association, but also for its distinctiveness, making it stand out against the muted tones of medieval architecture. Enforcement was swift and often brutal, carried out by Matilda's itinerant royal agents and local sheriffs who followed her campaigning armies. Imagine a small village in Hampshire suddenly occupied by Matilda's forces. A herald would ride through reading the decree. Then a royal agent would arrive, often carrying a small, perfectly square block painted in the exact shade of royal Matilda blue. Every homeowner would be forced to obtain the correct pigment and paint their door. The decree caused widespread panic and immense inconvenience. Obtaining the correct shade of blue pigment in wartime England was no easy task. Dyers and paint makers were suddenly overwhelmed with demand, often having to charge exorbitant prices for the precious blue. Common villagers, many of whom struggled to make ends meet, now faced the unexpected expense of a specific paint color. If a family could not afford the paint, or if their door was old and dilapidated and simply couldn't hold the color, they risked losing their home. Chroniclers of the period, such as William of Malmesbury, though largely critical of the Empress, noted her unyielding will and peculiar demands upon the populace in her efforts to secure the throne. While not detailing this specific decree, at length his accounts of the chaos and the Empress's often desperate measures hint at the kind of administrative oddities that arose from her precarious position. Letters from beleaguered villagers to distant relatives, now preserved in fragmentary form, sometimes described the sudden transformation of their homes into a patchwork of blue doors, a strange visual testament to a queen's iron will. The decree created a strange visual landscape across the lands Matilda held. Every village she swept through suddenly sported a striking uniform of blue doors, a silent, colorful declaration of allegiance. For those who resisted or simply could not comply, the consequences were severe. A family might return from their fields to find their home confiscated, its new occupants already painting over their old, unapproved door color with the mandated Royal Matilda Blue. This swift and public punishment served as a stark warning to others, while the Royal Matilda Blue door ordinance was ultimately a temporary measure, fading with the ebb and flow of the Civil War and the eventual compromise that ended the anarchy. It stands as a fascinating and deeply bizarre example of a medieval queen's attempt to assert control and identify loyalty. It turned every home into a public billboard of political allegiance, reflecting the desperate measures a monarch would take to secure her claim, even if it meant demanding a very specific color of paint on every loyal subject's front door.